Well, good morning, everybody. I just want to say that I am glad you're here today. I say this often to students when we get together, and I want to tell you all this, that I know there's lots of things that you could be doing right now, other places you could be. So thank you for being here. Thanks for being a part of this gathering today. Whether you've been coming here for a long time or a short time, or maybe it's even your first time here, I'm glad you're here with us. Or maybe you're like, oh man, it's Ben again. I really do wish I was somewhere else right now. That's okay. I'm not offended by that. Sometimes I get tired of me too. So that's why I pray that you'll encounter Jesus today. That through the Holy Spirit among the people in this place, that you'll hear something or experience something that will draw you closer to God. And I want to start with a question. How do you encounter God? Not theoretically, like, how does somebody or one encounter God? Like, I'm not asking to lay out a roadmap of steps to encounter God, but how do you connect with God? Or maybe you'd say, I'm not sure I ever have. Well, if you have, how has it happened? And does it still happen? Do you encounter God through like a cloud parting or a booming voice? Because that hasn't been my experience. I think we encounter God working on us through everything that happens in our lives. And I want you to think about this, that your honest story has the power to change lives. Your honest story has the power to change lives. I believe that when you share your hope or your struggles or your hurt with others, it really can lead to life change. And I believe that through a kind word or through a song or a hard conversation, that God works through these moments. I used to have this idea about how God prioritizes things. Like, he must have some system of dealing with all the prayer requests that we send up and all the circumstances that we get ourselves into. And I know that he's not exactly like us, that he can multitask. I think I can, but I'll admit to you, I can't. I'm not good at it. So I've learned to prioritize instead of multitask. Like, I'm watching TV, there's a text message, waiting for a reply. One of my boys is trying to get my attention. If you've got kids or been around kids, you know it's like, Dad, 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 Dad. The dog's like forcing her head up under my arm, trying to get some attention. My wife's on her way home on the speakerphone with me, and she's got an interesting story from work that she wants to share. So instead of losing it with all this going on, which I can't say never happens, I try to prioritize. I tell my wife, okay, I'll see you when you get home. Push the dog away. Calm my son down so I can get back to the real priority at hand. My new favorite TV show, Airplane Repo. Have you guys seen this show? Anybody out there seen it already? Airplane Repo? So in this show, people are behind on payments on their like Learjets and Cessnas and stuff like that. And there's these bounty hunters basically that are tracking them down to get those planes back for the bank. And they're usually like, the narrator's like, normally the safety pre-flight check takes 6 hours, but Tom only has 5 minutes before the owner shows up and like threatens him with a baseball bat. So he forgoes the safety warnings, fires the engines up, and heads off down the runway. I guess without even like telling air traffic control that he's doing this. But who cares really? It makes for some pretty exciting TV, and that sometimes is the priority of my day. But I've got to eliminate distractions and focus on my show. And maybe I can't multitask, but God can handle multiple things at once. Time to him is not the same as time to us. His mind is not our mind. And although we were created in his image, his ways higher than our ways. But for a long time, I assumed that God must evaluate whether a situation or prayer is important enough for him to consider. Here's an example. When I was in high school, my dad asked me for help. And really that means he told me I was going to go help him. Some old lady who lived nearby needed a washing machine moved out of her laundry room. So my dad and I go over to move it. We get there, and he's got his wrench out. He's disconnecting the water lines and the drain. And I'm waiting just outside. And the woman whose house we're at to move her washing machine says this, and I still remember it. She said, "Praise Jesus for my new washing machine." And I remember thinking right then, I was like 16 years old, Jesus doesn't care about your first world washing machine problem. I didn't understand then that God really does use the everyday trials of our lives to allow us to grow. In that moment, 16-year-old me thought, Jesus has bigger things on his mind, real problems to solve. He's not in the business of providing you a washing machine so your dirty clothes can get clean with the push of a button in your warm, cozy house. I was a pretty level-headed teenager, not judgmental. But later in life, as I experienced God moving in the details, I understood that God shows up in everything. That through the moments of our life, we encounter Jesus. It's not like we, bumble along, living these worthless lives, and then once a year, Jesus shows up. What that lady understood, better than me, was that God is in the business of working on us through the everyday stuff. In James chapter 1, I want to look at that today. We're also going to look at some verses in Acts, so you can flip to those places in your Bible if you brought it, or pull it up so it's handy on your phone. But in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, James writes this: "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." I came to this verse to share with you today because Bailey sent me a song. So Bailey, who was just up here, leads an amazing worship and redemptive arts team, sent me a song, one that he liked and he thought I'd like too. In a little bit, we're actually going to sing this song, or listen to this song, because there's some great lyrics I'd like you to think about. But listening to that song led me to this verse in James. Led me to think about perseverance and God working on us through our circumstances. And it led me to tell you that I believe your honest story has the power to change lives. In these verses, James says, "Consider it pure joy," meaning it takes thought, it takes intention. He says, consider it. He doesn't say, know it as pure joy. It says, consider. And joy, we've talked about that a lot recently, that sustaining connection that we have through the Holy Spirit in our lives that allows us to have hope in the good times and through rough times. So, consider it pure joy. Think of it as good for you and your faith whenever you face trials of many kinds. But who likes trials? Maybe there's some attorneys here who'd be like, I do. Well, I don't think James is talking about courtroom trials. James says trials of many kinds. Could be translated as all kinds or every kind. I think that includes the trials of everyday life. The things we sometimes think of as minor details or little bumps to just get past. But if we're honest with ourselves and with others in our life, I believe that honesty can be life-changing. So we read in this verse that through trials, our faith is tested and perseverance is the result. Now, perseverance, I do want more of that. And James writes that perseverance needs to finish its work so that I can become complete. I want that. Do you? To become complete and lacking nothing. Well, according to this, we've got to let perseverance do its work. So what does that look like in your life? for perseverance to do its work? What trials, even everyday common trials, do you face? And how could persevering through your trials be for your benefit? I believe God uses the trials of our life for good, for developing us, for growing us. Sometimes those are big trials that are difficult to understand. And I do believe that God can work those for good. But what I think James is getting at here is that there are trials occurring all the time. When I think about biblical perseverance, I think of a lot of different people. Think of Moses, think of Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Gideon. There's so many people that are good biblical examples of perseverance. But Paul really stands out to me. The guy who went from persecuting Christians to spreading the church of Jesus Christ throughout Europe and Asia. That's a guy who persevered. If you don't know Paul's story, I want to share a little bit about it with you. So Paul lived around the same time as Jesus, and was basically torturing people who were claiming that Jesus was the Son of God. The people who were following Jesus looked to him as their king, not the authorities who had power. And Paul was trying to eliminate that threat to power that he thought Jesus represented. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul has an encounter with the risen Jesus. And Jesus gives Paul a new vision for his life. So now Paul is encouraging people to choose Jesus as their king. He's spreading Jesus far and wide. And the Jewish religious leaders that Paul used to work with don't like this change, and they get Paul arrested. He spends years in prison. He gets transferred between prisons. He deals with governors and kings and torture. It's a life full of perseverance. And it's such an amazing life that while being held captive, Paul's telling his story to this particular king. It's in Acts chapter 26. Paul's telling his story to this particular king and governor because they want to know why he's in prison, basically. They're just trying to find some information about him. And he tells them that he's been traveling all over the region to share the hope that Jesus offers as the prophesied Son of God. And Governor Festus, who's there, interrupted him. Paul's giving his testimony, and Governor Festus stops him. And he's like, "Paul, you are out of your mind." That's literally what it says in the Bible. Acts 26, verse 24. He says, "Paul, you're out of your mind. They say Jesus is dead, but you say he's alive? You're nuts." And Paul answers in Acts 26, 25. "I am not insane. What I'm saying is true and reasonable." King Agrippa, who's also there, tells him he's familiar with these things. And then Paul asks Agrippa directly, "Do you believe the prophets?" He says, "I know you do." And then Agrippa answers him, "Do you think, Paul, that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul's answer to King Agrippa right there, as they've got him in front of him, Paul says, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." He's sharing the hope that Jesus has, even as he's speaking with these powerful men who could keep him locked up forever. But his motives are pretty clear. He just wants anyone he meets to have the same kind of transformation that he experienced through Jesus. And for those of us who would say we're following Jesus too, that's our mission. But man, I cannot compare my life to Paul's. I haven't been across the country, forming churches, facing trial and persecution and death for my beliefs. I haven't lived for years behind bars for my faith. I haven't been shipwrecked and stranded while traveling as a prisoner to Rome to face more trials. And I haven't been threatened with death for my beliefs. So how can I really be expected to become mature in my faith? I haven't faced trials like that. I haven't had to persevere like that. So why would I tell you that I think your honest story has the power to change lives? Because I believe we grow through trials of all sizes. And I believe that when we're honest about the trials we go through, and we can share how God helped us persevere through them, we can change lives. What trials have you faced this past year, or this month, or this week, or even today? How many of you started at a gym recently? Anybody here, like, new year, started at a gym? Well, I haven't. I just raised my hand so you knew what to do. Or maybe you've got the trial of a new job, right? Or waking up tired. That's a trial. That's an opportunity for perseverance. My son whining in the morning. I don't want Cheerios, right? I drop him off at daycare and I pick him up and he's whining again. And I've had a long day and I've looked forward to seeing him again. But he's just whining again because we're not going to go to Wendy's for supper. That's a trial. And if I allow God to work on me through that trial, I'm growing. I'm persevering. And Paul tells us that leads to maturity and completeness. For me, it's easier to think of these huge, gut-wrenching trials, like in Paul's life, as a kind of trial that will produce perseverance. Like, really make me suffer so I can learn. But it's really God working on us. It's seeing these common trials as opportunities to work on growing in empathy, in compassion, in boldness. It's tempting to compare our trials to what we see others face, and to imagine that God can only show us perseverance when we're in a life-shattering catastrophe. We even make fun of these everyday trials. We call them first world problems. Like the power moonroof stopped working in the car that I own. I've got a pantry full of food, but there's nothing to eat. I'm too hot. I'm too cold. When in reality, I could just walk over and adjust the thermostat. Those are all just from my life. I'm sure you can think of way more. But here's the deal. Those are all trials, all opportunities to grow, a chance to allow God to teach me through the frustrating moments of life. And I'm tempted to look at my kids' problems or the problems others face and think, well, that's ridiculous. That's just silly. Like for my 5-year-old, he gets really frustrated when the arms on his jacket are inside out and he can't flip them back. But guess what? That problem is real to my 5-year-old son. And it's really an opportunity for him to persevere and grow in maturity, as silly as it sounds to us. And at some point, I've got to recognize that it applies to me too. Even the everyday trials are opportunities for God to work on me. Sometimes it is a huge trial, and all I can do is hug my kid and cry with him. Last week, Shelley gave a great message about the giants in our lives, and there are definitely major things that we are called to face. But sometimes the trial is getting myself caught up in some annoying little argument. And if I can recognize that there is wisdom to be gained from every problem, no matter how small, then I can consider it joy as I go through the hour-by-hour trials of life. Joy, understanding that it's an opportunity for growth. Because that's what I believe James is talking about, that our lives are lived trial after trial. And not to say that God causes us to go through trials, but he can use them to teach us and to instruct us. So there's joy in it because of where it's leading me. And there have been some major opportunities for perseverance in my life. Waiting for a promised promotion at Ohio State when I used to work there that took 6 months longer than it should have. My wife and I going through the happiness of finding out that she was pregnant and then learning not long after that she'd had a miscarriage. Approaching the 4-way stop that leads out of my neighborhood during morning rush hour. There's 8 lanes of traffic there, no signal, and 7 idiots plus me trying to navigate it. Or watching, a fashion design show with my wife and knowing full well that it's not just a waste of my time or her time or the designer's time or the producer's time or everyone's time who's involved in making that show. I mean, come on. There's kids without shoes in the world, and they're working towards designing like $10,000 dresses. But then, of course, I turn around and I watch a show like Airplane Repo. So maybe my frustration with the fashion show is another opportunity to persevere. Not really. That show is trash. Sorry, Cynthia. But the point is, there are trials. Life is full of them. And often they're back to back to back. But these trials are our lives. And the goal isn't to stop having problems. The goal, as Paul states it in 1 Corinthians 9:24-27, he says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." Paul, during his life, faced trial after trial, but he was able to, in the moment, appreciate the opportunities. He's being held captive, and he's preaching the hope of Jesus to the guys who are holding him captive, to Agrippa and Festus. The testing of faith is producing something eternal in Paul, and it can in us too. And Jesus knows what it's like to deal with the trials of everyday life. Sure, he understands major trial, becoming the sacrifice for our sins, but he was also born human. I want to share an example from Luke 24. So at this point, Jesus has already been crucified and resurrected. He's already risen and appeared to some. And the disciples are gathered together talking about it. It says, "While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.'" Right? He just appears. It says they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And then it says they still don't believe because they're in awe and wonder. I can understand where they were coming from. There's this joy and amazement. They're trying to figure this out. They're trying to wrap their minds around it. Here's Jesus, the man they knew, the man who was put to death and buried. And he's here again, standing right next to him. They're trying to take it all in, this awe and wonder settling in over him. And I imagine that the room goes silent. And then Jesus responds, "Do you have anything to eat?" That's what he says to him. "Do you have anything to eat?" And I think it shows, one, that Jesus has a sense of humor, but also that he understood what it's like to be human, what it's like to be hungry, what it's like to face the everyday trials of life, because he lived it. And if the crucifixion can be the start of resurrection, if that trial can lead to everlasting life, then my trials can be the start of growth. My trials can be an opportunity for perseverance, as I'm being made complete through Jesus. I believe your honest story has the power to change lives. Your everyday trials and the chances you have to share them can change lives. Being honest about where you have doubts in your faith. I remember being in a life group. We were talking about some of our doubts, some current doubts and some former doubts. And it was honestly life-changing to hear others share some of the same things that I've been struggling with, and sharing wisdom from their lives. Or hearing that others also deal with anger on the road. That helps too. What's really helpful is when it moves beyond just complaining to "this is how I learned" to not let it affect me as much. Those are moments where honesty about the trials we face can change lives, because it happens moment by moment, as Mike Wayner was sharing a few weeks ago. I'll share one last example, and then I want to listen to this song that Bailey is going to lead. The song is called "Around the Corner" by Mike Maines and the Branches. It's not a worship song, but it's got a good message of perseverance and not giving up. Because things can get frustrating. The moments of your life can be frustrating. But being honest about your frustrations has the power to change lives. One section of the song goes like this: "Everybody needs a little bit of sunshine, a torch to light and carry through the dark night. My story's the same as yours, different details in between. I lost my faith, once was blind, then I saw the light around the corner." When Cynthia and I were just married, we were doing a fast with this church. It was a Daniel fast. Some of you know what that is. We were doing this for wisdom into how we as a church could move forward in a particular area. And it's a restrictive diet, the Daniel fast. Basically just like nuts and fruit and vegetables. That's it. And so Cynthia's making dinner one night, and she's going to put a can of tomatoes in it. But these tomatoes have salt added, and salt isn't allowed on the Daniel fast. So I'm like, well, if you put that in there, I'm not going to eat it. And she's like, fine, you don't have to eat it. And I left the house. I had a meeting to go to. I left, and it was the first time I'd left without telling her I love you. I was mad. I was upset about that salt she was about to put in our food. And a buddy of mine who loves Jesus was at that meeting, and I was telling him what just happened. And I was sure he'd be like, yeah, no salt allowed on the Daniel fast. But instead, he said, man, you got to let that one go. Don't stay mad over salt added to a can of tomatoes. And it was such a small trial, kind of a first world problem for me. But if my buddy hadn't shared that wisdom with me that night, I probably would have stayed mad about those tomatoes. And it changed my life. Because that was a real, honest example of how a small trial could wreak major havoc. I could have let that anger and that feeling of being right about the salt to take over. But it would have prevented me from loving my wife the way God would want me to, in the way I know I should. So as you listen to this song, I want you to think about the trials that you go through every day. Think of the opportunities that you have for perseverance. And think of how your honest story has the power to change lives.